Hi guys, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to handle form data using PHP. I'm going to show you all the common form elements that we mostly use in a form, like input fields, text areas, select drop-down menus, radio buttons, and checkboxes. You're going to learn how to set up a form using all the elements that I mentioned and how to fetch their values using PHP. We are going to sanitize and validate the submitted values, so the data will be clear and safe for further process. Also, we are going to show validation error messages when the values don't meet our criteria and a success message when everything goes well. So without wasting any time, let's start coding. In my editor, I have an index.php file which contains a basic HTML structure. This file will host the HTML form. I have a form validation.php file. In this file, we sanitize and validate the submitted form data. And last, I have a styles.css file with some basic CSS rules to make a form look nice and well structured. Okay, let's start the tutorial by creating first HTML form containing all the form elements that I mentioned in the intro. The form that I will create will gather personal data to create a user profile, so I will name the form profile form. I will leave the action attribute empty, which means that the form will submit the data to the same page. I will set the method attribute to post, which means that our data will be sent securely to the server in the request body. And lastly, I will leave the enctype attribute empty. This means that the browser will encode the data as key value pairs, which is the default behavior. You will see this when we start coding in PHP. Our first field will be a text input field where the user will enter the first name. The input field has an ID of first name and the label has a for attribute of first name. Using the same value in the input's ID and in the label's for attribute, we associate the label with the input field. The type attribute is set to text and the name attribute is set to first name. We leave the value attribute empty for now. Next, I will create an email input field. Again, I will associate the label with the input field. This time, I will set the type attribute to email. By doing so, the browser will perform a quick email validation check when the form is submitted. I will set the name to email and again I will leave the value attribute empty. Our next input field will be a text area where the user can write a few words about themselves. The same applies here as before. We associate the label with the text area and set the name attribute to profile description. Next, we will have a drop-down select menu where the user will choose their favorite color. Again, we associate the label with the select menu and set the name attribute to favorite color. The options available to the users are red, green, blue, and black. Looking closer, you will see that the difference between the text and values is that the text starts with an uppercase letter, while the value is all in lowercase. You will see how we will use that to preserve the selected option when we start dealing with errors. Next, we are going to have two radio buttons where the user can choose their gender. The input elements are inside in a div element with a class of radio buttons that is only for styling purposes. To display the input fields as radio buttons, we have to set the type attribute to radio. To group them together, we set their name attribute to the same value. In our case, we set the name to gender. The first radio button has a value of male and the second radio button has a value of female. Next, we are going to have checkboxes where the user can choose their favorite food. With checkboxes, we can select more than one value, whereas with radio buttons, we can choose only one. To display an input element as checkbox, we set its type attribute to checkbox. To group checkboxes together, we set their name attribute to the same value just as we did with the radio buttons. However, unlike radio buttons, checkboxes allow multiple selections. To store the selections, we pass in the name attribute an array. The square brackets indicate that favorite foods is an array. You will see when we start writing PHP. The first input field has a value of pizza, the second a value of spaghetti, and the third a value of broccoli. Now let's move to our last element, and that is the submit button. We can use a regular button element and set its type to submit. By doing so, the button will act as a submit button. I'll set the name to submit and the visible text also to submit. And we are done with HTML form. Let me show you how it looks in the browser. We have the first name, the email, the text area to insert the profile description, the drop-down select menu, the radio buttons to choose gender, the checkboxes, and the submit button. Nice, everything is here. Now let's go back to the editor and start making this form functional using PHP. I will jump to the PHP file, and the first thing I'll do is to create an error variable for each input field. So I will have a first name error variable, an email, a profile description, an error variable for the favorite color drop-down menu, as well as a gender and a favorite food. Also, we'll have a database error variable to store any error that may occur when inserting data into the database, and a success message variable to display a message when everything goes well. All these error variables will be set to null. Next, I'll check if there is a post request. If that's the case, I'll create a user data variable and assign it the value of the post superglobal. Now the user data variable holds all the data the form submits when we click the submit button. Let me show you what that looks like. I'll use the var export function to display the user data variable on the screen. But first I have to require the form validation.php file in the top of the index file to execute the code. Now let's go ahead and fill in some values in the form. I'll enter a first name, an email, a few words in the profile text area, choose a favorite color, select a gender, check pizza and spaghetti, and then press the submit button. And here we have the data that was submitted by the form. Let me copy and paste this into an empty file so you can see it more clearly. As you can see, the user data variable is an associative array. The keys are the name attributes of the input fields and the values are the data we typed in. So we have the first name, the email, the profile description, the selected color from the drop-down menu, and the gender. Up to this point, each key holds a single value. But take a look at the favorite foods key. It holds an array. That's because we selected multiple checkboxes, pizza and spaghetti. Remember, we set the name attribute of each checkbox to an array so we could store multiple values. That's why we see an array here. And finally, we also have the submit button. It doesn't have a value and we won't be using it in this tutorial. Okay, now let's head back to the PHP file and start validating the submitted values. I will start with the first name and I will check if it has a value. For that, I will use the empty function and also trim any leading or trailing spaces from the value. If the first name is empty, I will assign the string "please enter your first name" to the first name error variable. Next, I will say else if, and I will use a regular expression to allow only alphabetic characters and a single space in the first name. Again, I will trim the first name before validating. If the validation fails, I will throw an error that says the field accepts only alphabetic characters and a single space. Next, I will go to the index.php file and under the first name input, I will open PHP tags. I will check if there is a first name error. If that is the case, I will exit PHP and create a paragraph element with a class of error to display the first name error variable. Also, I will set the value attribute of the input to the submitted first name so we don't lose the data in case of an error. The @ sign prevents the server from throwing a warning when the page first loads. That is because initially there is no post variable, and the server will throw an undefined index warning. The @ symbol suppresses that. Now let's go to our browser and check if the first name validation works as expected. I will leave the first name empty and submit the form. We see an error message that says "please enter your first name." Next, I will type the first name George followed by some numbers and press the submit button. We see an error saying the field accepts only alphabetic characters and a single space. Let's remove the numbers. Okay, we see no error. Now let's test if a single white space works. Let's enter Billy Joe. Nice, it passes the validation. Okay, now let's add another space to see what happens. And as expected, we see the error again. Great, our first name validation works fine. Now let's go back to the PHP file and continue with the email validation. I'm going to continue with an else if statement to check if the email field is not empty. Like before, I'm using the empty and trim functions. If the field is empty, I'm going to assign the string "please fill in your email" to the email error variable. Next, I'm using the filter var function with a filter validate email flag to check if the email has the proper format. If not, I will return a message that says "please enter a valid email address." Next, I will go to index.php file, and under the email input field, I will do the same thing I did with the first name. I will check if there is an email error, and if so, I will echo that error to the screen. And again, I will assign to the value the submitted email. Okay, now I'm not going to test it in the browser to see if it works, which it does, but I will test all the inputs once I'm done with the code. Alright, now let's go back to the PHP file and continue the validation. Our next step is to validate the profile description, which is our text area. Again, I will check if the field is empty. If it is, I will assign to the profile description error variable the text "please write a few words about you." Now I will jump to the index file, and under the text area I will display the error if there is one. I will also echo the submitted description inside the text area's body. Okay, we are done with the text area, so we are going back to the PHP file to validate the drop-down menu. Again, I will check if there is an option selected that has a value. If not, I will throw an error that says "please select your favorite color." The empty function will work here as well. Let me show you why. Let's see the option values. The first option tag, which says "select a color," has no value. It's an empty string. All the other option tags have values: red, green, blue, and black. So when we submit the form with the first option selected, the empty function will see that there is no value and will return true. Okay, now since we are in the index file, let's display also the error under the select menu. Again, if the favorite color error variable equals true, we display the error. Now let's see how to display the selected option in case there is an error anywhere else in the form. I will go above the first option tag and open PHP tags. I will check if there is a favorite color submitted and if it's not empty. Then I will exit PHP and display an option tag. I will set its value attribute to the submitted favorite color, and for the display text, I will also show the submitted color but capitalize the first letter. Actually, we don't need the @ sign here. And that's it. Now let's continue with the radio buttons. Again, using an else if statement, I will check if a radio button has been selected. This time I will use the isSet function. The reason for this is that when the form is submitted without a selected radio button, nothing related to it appears in the post superglobal variable. So if no value is selected, I will assign to the gender error variable the text "please select your gender." Okay, now let's go and display the error message under the radio buttons. I will check if the gender error variable is set, and if it is, I will display the error text. Next, let's see how we can preserve the selected radio button in case there is an error elsewhere in the form when it's submitted. Above the first radio button, I will open PHP tags. Then I will create two variables, male radio and female radio, and initialize them to null. I will check if a gender is selected and whether its value is male. If that's the case, I will assign the string checked to the male radio variable. I will do the same for the female option. I will say else if and check if the gender is set and if its value equals female. If true, I'll assign the string checked to the female radio variable. Next, in the male radio button, I will echo the male radio variable. I'll do the same for the female radio button with a female radio variable. It makes sense, right? The value checked assigned to each variable corresponds to the checked HTML attribute used by radio buttons. This way, if the form submission fails due to an error anywhere in the form, the selected radio button remains selected. Now let's move on and validate our last input fields, the checkboxes. In the PHP file, I will check if a favored food has been selected using the isSet function again. If nothing is checked, I will display an error that says "please select at least one favorite food." Now let's go back to the index file to display the error. If the favorite food error variable is set, that means there is an error, so I will display the error message. Next, let's see how we preserve the checked values. Again, I will go above the first checkbox and open PHP tags. I will use the same logic as I did with the radio buttons. I will create 3 variables: pizza checked, spaghetti checked, and broccoli checked, and initialize them to null. Then I will check if a favorite food has been submitted. Remember, the checked values are stored in an array. So I will use the inArray function to check if each value exists in the favorite foods array. I will start with the pizza value. If it exists in the array, I will assign the string checked to the pizza checked variable. I will do the same for the spaghetti and the broccoli values. Next, I will echo the pizza checked variable in the pizza checkbox, the spaghetti checked variable in the spaghetti checkbox, and the broccoli checked variable in the broccoli checkbox. And that's it. We are done validating the inputs. Now we are going to collect all the validated values and insert them into the database. So let's go back to the PHP file. Now this is our final step, so I will use an else statement instead of else if. I will create variables for each input value. First, I will store the first name in the first name variable, trimming any leading or trailing whitespace. I will do the same for the email and the profile description. However, for the profile description, I will also use the HTML special characters function to sanitize the input. I will apply the same approach to the favorite color and gender. Since the favorite foods are submitted as an array, I will use the implode function to convert the array values into a single string separated by commas. Next, I will insert these values into the database. But before that, let me show you the structure of the database table. I have a database named tutorials, and inside it there is a table named profile data. Now inside the table I have an ID column, a first name, an email, a profile description, a favorite color, a gender, and a favorite foods column. There's nothing special here, so it's a simple and straightforward table. Okay, now let's go back to the PHP file. Okay, our next step is to connect to the database. But I don't want any connection errors showing up on the screen. Instead, I want to log those errors into a file. To do that, I'll use the MySQL report function and pass in the MySQL report of flag. This tells MySQL not to display any errors on the screen. Next, I'll connect to the database using the MySQL object. Now notice the @ symbol in front of it. That simply tells PHP to suppress any connection error messages that might pop up. Then I'll check if the connection was successful using the connect error number property. If everything is fine, it returns 0. But if it's not 0, that means there was an error. In that case, I'll use PHP's error log function to write the error into a file called errors.log. The error log function takes 3 arguments. First, the actual error message. Second, the number 3, which tells PHP we want to write to a file. And third, the name of that file, which is errors.log. Let's also make sure our log message is clear. I'll include a timestamp using the date function, followed by the message database connection error, and finally I will attach the actual error message returned by MySQL. Also, I want to write the message in its own line. Now let's create the errors.log file so we're ready to log anything if needed. Perfect. Let me show you how a typical error looks in the log file. You'll see the exact time that the error happened, our custom message, and the full error from MySQL. We've now set up error logging for our database connection. Let's move on and continue building the script. Next, if the connection is successful, I will write the SQL query to insert the data into the database. I will use a MySQL prepared statement to prevent SQL injection. As you can see, instead of directly inserting the incoming data, I have used question marks as placeholders in the query. We're inserting data into 6 columns, so we need 6 question marks in total. Later on, we will bind each of these placeholders to its respective value. Now, I'll use the prepare method and pass the SQL query as an argument. The returned object will be stored in a variable called statement. Next, I will use the bindParam method to bind the placeholders to actual values. The first argument of bindParam is a string that represents the data types of each parameter. Since all our values are strings, we'll pass in 6 times the letter S for each string value. Then we provide the actual variables in order: first name, email, profile description, favorite color, gender, and favorite foods. Now we can execute the query. And that's how a prepared statement is constructed in PHP using MySQL. After executing, I'll check if the query was successful using the affected rows property. Since we're inserting one record, we expect affected rows to be equal to 1. If that's the case, I'll display a success message and call unsetPost to clear the submitted form data. If something goes wrong, I'll assign an error message to the database error variable that says something went wrong, please try again. And with that final step, we're done with the PHP file. The last thing to do is to go back to the index file and display the success message or database error if there is one. I will display the success message above the first name input field and the database error under the submit button. And we are done, guys. Now let's see if everything works. I will fill out the form with the correct values and then I'm going to make some mistakes. I'm gonna say Dennis@mail.com. My name is Dennis. I choose black as my favorite color. I'm not going to check a gender. And favorite foods, pizza and spaghetti. I press the submit button and we see an error that I must choose a gender. Great, despite the error and the page that was reloaded, we didn't lose the values that we entered. Let's try another one. Let's choose a gender and not selecting a favorite color. As expected, we see a message that we have to choose a favorite color. And again, all the values entered in the fields are present. Let's try last one. I will choose a favorite color and I will uncheck the favorite foods. Nice. Our validation works fine. Now let's enter the data in the database. Great, we see the success message. Now let's check also the database. And here we have our record. The first name, the email, the profile description, the favorite color, the gender, and the favorite foods combined in a string and separated by comma. And that's it, guys, for today. Now, if you want to learn how to store and edit messages in a JSON file, watch this video next. Thanks for watching, guys. Subscribe if you like. See you in the next one.